Welcome to another episode of the Slice of Mentorship podcast. I'm your host, Igor Gorlotov, and today we're joined by Dianne Welsh, the Hayes Distinguished Professor of Entrepreneurship at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Dianne is a powerhouse in the field of entrepreneurship, with accolades including the Fulbright Hall Distinguished Chair in Entrepreneurship and the Board of Governors Teaching Award. Her work spans family business, international entrepreneurship, women-owned businesses, and franchising. With numerous books and over 150 publications, Dianne's insights have shaped the entrepreneurial landscape. Let's dive into her remarkable journey and explore her innovative approaches to entrepreneurship. Hi, Dianne.
Hi, Igor.
Thank you so much for hosting me today in your office and agreeing to do this podcast.
Thank you very much for coming up to UNCG.
So we had a little bit of conversations while prepping for this podcast. And my first question to you is, how do you get to teach when you teach entrepreneurship? How do you get to teach students just do it skill?
The just do it skill is really important to teach. One thing is through internships, through experience, through bringing in speakers that give them a roadmap, that they're a model of how they can do it. Oftentimes what I do is bring in students that have started their own business and to show students, other students, well, if that person can do it, then I can do it. And so I think those models, and I bring in my own models and tell them stories of my life. And then I wrote a book on entrepreneurial family business, which is about my family's business and how my father created the very first soft-sided luggage in the world. And so I think from that, seeing that modeling, that's a really good way to do it.
And if we go one level deeper, so you mentioned your real-life experience, a real-life experience of other students who started built businesses or guest speakers, beyond just bringing them and exposing them to students. Are there any other pieces that make this exposure more impactful?
I think having them put down a plan of how they can move ahead, and that could be very simple, like a professional as well as a personal plan of how they're going to make that mesh and work together. And that can be very simple, like a 3-page outline. But what I've learned is that when students put things down on paper, and all of us put things down on paper, number one, we're more apt to do it. And number two, we can see the roadmap and we can think through things much more clearer. So that is really not only giving them the models, but then applying it to them.
There is a professor at UNC Charlotte, Justin Webb, and I'm going to talk with him soon on a similar podcast. And he mentioned one of the challenges in terms of entrepreneurship is that students who come to UNC Charlotte are more corporate focused. They're looking for a job. They're not like, they do not see the exact connection, how entrepreneurship can be relevant to them. What's your experience of working with those students, and is it possible to make them into, if not entrepreneurs, into intrapreneurs, so innovators inside their jobs?
Well, I taught at University of North Carolina, Charlotte one summer, and I'm here, of course, now for 16 years at University of North Carolina, Greensboro, but I helped them during the summer, and I taught a business plan class, and that is absolutely true. That and much of that is because of the marketplace, what the jobs are. In Charlotte, there's a lot of banking, a lot of finance industries, so they are more corporate. But we can incorporate entrepreneurship everywhere, and that's why I wrote the book, Cross-Disciplinary Entrepreneurship. But that's why we have 40 courses in 17 departments, because you can teach entrepreneurship everywhere. And you can be a corporate entrepreneur. So my definition of entrepreneurship is to be creative and innovative in all you do that creates value. And companies need individuals to create value, to be innovative and creative. All good companies need that. And so you can do that within a corporate environment as well as a small business or a medium business environment. There may be certain hurdles that you have to do to work through, but good companies like 3M, for instance, give you the laboratories to play, to experiment, to create innovation, and some of the ownership that comes from that. So that's a great example.
I'm also passionate about getting people to innovate within a bigger organizations. And it's great if you've got 3M where there is the culture of innovation and everything is kind of set up for you to come in and reap the benefits. But there are companies who are not like that.
Yes.
And I think when we talked as a preparation for this, I challenged a little bit your definition, because to me it seems that a lot of burden is just on one person, that entrepreneurship is happening like, oh, you need to be creative and innovative and things will happen. Whereas the perspective I come to see and appreciate that it takes a team of innovators to make elephants dance. So what's your take on this?
That's absolutely correct, Igor. It's not personal, but you need to have that mindset to work with as well as the skill set. So I always say it's not just mindset, it's skill set. Otherwise, we wouldn't need to teach entrepreneurship. And so that's a really important part of it. But absolutely, what we know in entrepreneurship is that 9 times out of 10, it's the team that creates and the team that innovates and moves forward. But you all have to have that mindset. And I think it's a lifelong mindset, so that you're always looking for something new and that you can recreate yourself as the economy changes. So that's extremely important in today's world.
I could talk a lot about this, but you mentioned the book that you wrote, and you have a lot of history in terms of business, in terms of family business, and family businesses in general. I understand that this is your passion. You help different family business figure out family dynamics. Could you share some insights or strategies that family business can apply to be more effective, more innovative, and more successful?
Well, I do that in my book, Entrepreneurial Family Business. I just wrote it in 2022. My family took a sporting goods business that had gear bags in it for hunting and fishing, and were made for military, putting all rifles in during World War I and World War II, and took those gear bags and basically made soft-sided luggage out of it for the world in the early 60s. So it was the first business that created soft-sided luggage that we are aware of. What we know from a study I did with Kirby Rosplock and myself and some other authors is that if subsequent generations of that family are not innovative and entrepreneurial, then it won't survive. So like things like family offices, the wealth in the family, they need to be innovative. They need to do different things. So for instance, Los Linguas business, the Claro family, the patriarch right now, the grandfather, because there's 3 generations I interviewed, he got the idea that there was a lot of growth in Santiago, and they're more south in the wine area, but it's very accessible by the interstate. And he realized there was a need to have families have sort of a country place, out in nature. And so he bought some land next to Los Linguas that wasn't really farm-oriented. It wasn't able to be tilled and stuff. So he bought it very reasonable, and then he started dividing it into plots and making cottages, you'd call them, I'd say, country cottages. And it was very popular, and he's done very well. And that's an example of being entrepreneurial and innovative from basically what a farm was.
When I hear the words family dynamics or family business, I see like this word family means that it's not like a typical business. There are other relationships in play, and sometimes those relationships come with negative consequences when like employees who are not family members become jealous of family member employees, some interpersonal relationships. And you talk a lot about, or not a lot, but you talk a little bit about this in your book. Could you share your lessons learned from being in a family business and helping other family businesses? What are the highs and lows of working in a business like that?
Well, I think you have to understand that it's human nature, and that immediately people that are non-family business members are going to say, what's in it for me? Like we all do, what's in it for me? Family members say that too. And how do you make sure that everyone is treated fairly and that they're promoted and that the good people stay with you, because that's what you need to sustain and grow in a business. And so it's really important to put job descriptions in place, have everything out in public, have an annual evaluation. Everybody's on the same playing field with that evaluation so that there's very clear measures of how you move up in the company, how you can take different positions. So it's that very open atmosphere has got to be a basic to that business. Also, I highly recommend family businesses to write a small book. And this can even be done in classes where my students in family business, they do, a history of the family business, about the family business, about the family, about the business, and then a strategic plan. But providing new employees with a history of the business, because it's so important to understand that culture. And the culture in that family business is going to be very unique. And it's important for them to understand that, everybody to understand that. And I also think that's important to give to family members. And you can start kids in family businesses and actually have them do something in a family business and be around it from the time that I believe they're like 6. And that training, that modeling is very important. And people learn the most by modeling, even though you may not say directly, I'm teaching you to do this. They just, by modeling, by watching, they learn. It's just osmosis. They learn a great deal. Also, I think it's important for family business members not to take that family business home with them. And I've over the years, I've had students that say, there is no way I want to go into the family business because I heard about it every night at the dinner table between my mom and my dad or my grandfather or grandmother, whatever. They just are over. They're done with it. And I remember at one university I was at where I had the father come in and say, my son is in your family business class and you must get them to take over the family business. And so I had to sort of back up to get everything working right in that. But it was this is what they need to do and you need to change the person's mind. And the student was like, no way am I going to do that. I've heard too much bad things about this. Why do I want to ruin my life and come into the family business? So I think it's very important for, especially with this generation, to make it clear that there's a life beyond the family business. So they can work in the family business, but that's not their whole life. And this generation is their private time, their personal time is very important to them. So I think that separation between the family business and your home life is very important as these siblings grow up, for instance.
I think one of the challenges with a family business, if you are part of the family, but you are not the decision maker. Mm-hmm. And you might not be happy with certain pieces of how the decisions are made. Are there ways to mitigate that? Or it's you either fit in or exit?
Well, due to Farms, which is one of the largest family businesses in the United States, they have hundreds of family members, multiple generations all over the United States. And they have they have a picnic once a year, and everybody comes, and then and it's a picnic with, working meetings also, but they also have a very clear constitution and values and what's important to that, and they really believe that's what's carried them through the years. They also have a policy where you can opt in or opt out of being in the family business. So you might have stock, but you know that when you say, hey, I'm not going to work at the family business, I want to move to California instead of being down in Florida, that you've sort of lost that right to make decisions. And so there's ways that family businesses can be set up so that the people that are involved in the family business have the decision-making power, and the people that say, this isn't really for me, they may own stock, or they may not, or they might sell it, but they have some choices too. So that it's very clear. Again, it goes back to that openness and then having everything in writing.
I like how you always start, or not always, but in this conversation, you start with great examples like 3M or like family businesses who have created the right structure. But a lot of family businesses, and I'm coming from Eastern Europe, from Belarus, where like people didn't know what they were doing when they were starting a family business. My wife is from a family business like that. Her grandmother started a school. And sometimes this founder doesn't have the maturity or understanding of how to navigate that. And I read your book about your family business, and it looked from the book that you were also in a situation when your family was very invested. It was driving the business, but you were not the main shareholders in the business, not the main decision makers. Could you talk a little bit about your experience of growing up and navigating that challenge?
Yeah. Well, and Igor, that is the most common type of family business, is when somebody just says, we're going to do a family business. And I get students in the classroom, oftentimes in my family business classes, that, by the way, are very popular. I've gone from, when I started the family business class here in 2009, I think I had 9 students, and now I've got 60, and if I opened it up to more students than that, I'd probably have 100. So it's gotten very popular, and a lot of those students don't have a business in the family. They want to start a business.
This is a great answer, but you're moving into academic, and I'm trying to get into personal.
Okay.
And the personal side of the story that you describe in the book, where you're not setting the rules, you're not educating anyone, you're a young girl and then teenager who is working in a family business run by like your father, your mother, your uncle, and other family members.
Yes.
You have a role to play, and I'm curious about like, what was your experience like? What were the kind of rewards and challenges of being in a business where you're not a professor who can tell people how to do things, where you are just someone inside?
The positive on that is that by modeling, I got a lot of wonderful life lessons and business lessons to see how a business can start from really good ideas, where somebody just said, hey, you know, there's problems with luggage being too heavy, and it's back in the 60s it opened up on, you know, it was the metal with, you know, vinyl on the outside, and it pop open on luggage carriers, and somebody taking, hey, you know, here's a bag we do gear bags for hunting and fishing, maybe we can make luggage out of this, and seeing that creative process, you know, with somebody that really didn't have any kind of engineering, didn't have any experience. My father had a high school degree, my mother had a high school degree, and to see how a business starts and what it takes to make it work. I remember as a kid, we would go on Saturdays and my parents would clean out the sewing machines because somebody had to do it. They didn't have the money to hire somebody to do it, so they went and did it. And we would play and, you know, sweep floors for $1 an hour, but we were around that factory and we knew how I worked at every part of that factory except sewing. My mother always said it's a good thing you make money with your mouth instead of your hands, and that was absolutely true, because I probably would have had a lot of fingers with needles through them if I didn't. You know, they knew better not to put. But I worked in shipping, I worked in sales. In college I did on the road sales to get a company car. So that was the trade-off with that. And I learned the value of money and how important that was. I also had to deal with some issues like, oh, she gets to take off the afternoon because she's the president's daughter, or, she's going to get promoted and we can't do that, but she can't. And so there's a lot of jealousy and a lot of unknowns always in family businesses, that growing up as a kid in a family business, I think I learned a lot about human relations and how to negotiate from that, and also how to realize in any work environment you're going to have people that are jealous of you. In any profession you're going to have that. And it's always, what my philosophy is, always support the person. Always, if something good happens to somebody, don't be jealous. Be verbal and say, hey, that's really great, you got that promotion or that job. And to support people in the workplace, and to ask them, what is a reward for you? Because people have different rewards. What's a reward to me might not be a reward for you. And so knowing their reward systems, knowing their personal background makes a real difference in terms of moving forward in your professional and personal life. And so I think I also saw the negatives in a family business, and there were a lot of those also. The hours, the bringing work home. We never were paid, my family, what they deserved. And as soon as my dad retired and my mother retired with him, the wages went up 100 times to the people they brought in. But my dad's philosophy was, we got to get the building paid for. We need money in the bank. I want to leave this as a very stable business after 17 years. So there was a drive about that where their priorities were different past their personal paycheck. And I think that was what separates family businesses a lot. So I always give the advice to students. I'm very, very determined to tell them, always own 51% of the business. Because if you don't, no matter what you're doing, you aren't going to have that decision making. And also when you get an agreement, that it should be, if one person's putting in the majority of the money, but the other person is putting in the hard work and really building the business and doing all the creative ideas and working on, all the time there, what is the value of that and how does that translate? And it's got to be set up from the beginning. So I think many times when people get in family business, they're not thinking any of that. They're just thinking, I'm going to go in business with my sister. I'm going to go in, everything's going to be great. And I've seen this over and over again. I actually had two students that started a business together, and they ended up in court because one student put in the money, the other person put in the hard work, and there wasn't anything in paper to say, who owns what and how much do they own. And when things sort of moved forward a little bit and they started making a profit, one said, no, that's mostly mine. The other one said, no, you didn't do any work. And, and you got this situation. So that's why I always drive home to students, to any family business I'm working in, to make sure that paperwork's on, even if you wait a while to start the business, to get everything put in place first. And that's just so important. Most businesses don't do that. And most businesses, even if they've been in existence for 20 or 25 years, still don't have that down. And that's why oftentimes, like I said, when we require all the students to work with a family business in that class, and they do these interviews, and then they give the interview sheets back to the business so they have all of it. But 99% of the time, they don't have all this stuff in writing. And they won't, also the other thing is family business are very secretive, so they don't like to show you anything if they do have it, right? But most of the time they don't. And then when things get moving on, and unfortunately there has to be a succession plan, because when there isn't, disasters can happen. So I had a situation at one of the universities where the spouse, it was a wife, came in to see me and needed help, and her husband died at age 50 unexpected. And there was no succession plan, and her kids were all too young to take over the business. And there was nothing, in writing. And this is like the worst of the situation. And she went in and she actually did a really good idea keeping it going and stuff, and then trying to put those pieces in place. But you don't want to do that to anybody. You really need, and you want it to be very clear, because if there isn't, that's when there's huge conflicts between, family members, who's going to take over. Situations where there's two CEOs usually doesn't work. And, and there's always that competition. So finding a really good place for people with their skill set is really important. Maybe they're not meant to be the CEO, but maybe they're the vice president of marketing, for instance, and that they have a sphere that they're in charge of, which is really important, versus in family businesses, lots of times you get people getting into other people's bailiwicks all the time and trying consistently to do that, which is why really good people leave lots of times.
And I think that's true not only of family businesses, honestly. My first business I started, I didn't have this kind of partnership charter. And when I moved from Belarus to Charlotte, it was kind of difficult to figure out how the business should continue. Luckily, we figured it out. But when I was in the States, I came across the book. It's called Partnership Charter. And every business relationship I started with the book and answering difficult questions when you are still in love, when you want to work with each other. And then I had to separate with one of my first business partners, and we stayed friends. We were able to do it. It was not an easy process still, but I'm totally with you. It helps to plan in advance and to kind of figure this out. And a lot of people just, are scared to have the conversation with their potential partner. And if it's a family member, I'm sure there are more aspects involved.
And I think that's really important in life, to have those conversations with a potential spouse. And a lot of people just avoid that, and that's why we have the divorce rate we do lots of times.
I agree. But speaking of spouses, I think one of the themes that I saw in your book was about gender roles. Maybe it was not as explicit, but you talked about your mother doing a lot of innovation and doing a lot of customer support, coming up with ideas, doing so much, and not being paid fully for this. And then with you being 21 and really interested in the business when the transition was happening, you were not considered for the role. So how has that experience influenced your perspective on gender roles? Because right now the situation is totally different, but I'm really curious in your insider view on this.
And that was about 1978, 79, so it was quite a while ago. And I can say that my mother wasn't paid for all her successes she brought to the business. She created the second most popular color. It was a denim with red trim of the luggage, and it was the second best seller, and she's the one that created that.
Wow.
And a bunch of other designs and stuff that didn't always sell so well. But, it wasn't that she was singled out. It was that our family wasn't paid what they should, and a lot of that was a function of my father wanting to get the building paid off and leave a legacy that was totally able to be picked up for the next generation. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes you see that in family businesses where the grandparents will, really be very careful with the money and the growth and what they're paid, because they want it there for the next generation. That the most important thing to them is that business succeeds into time. But saying that, there was definitely a gender issue with, wait a minute, who grew up in this business, who lives in this little town of Iowa Falls, Iowa, population 5,000, that is a natural to take over the business versus, family members cousins that never lived in Iowa Falls, never would move there after they took over the business. And, manufacturing is a people business. You have to be there. You have to keep things going. You can't, it's not like something you can run from afar with a computer or something. So yes, absolutely, that was an issue. And to this day, I'm thinking, to this day still, I was probably the best one to take over that business. But there was also an age difference. I just got out of college. I was all of 21 years old. So I think it was age, experience, and gender, not just gender. So if I would have been 35, like the person that did take over the business was, then that might have been different, and I didn't go back to work in the business after college either. I took a sales job with a national company and was out exploring my life at 21. So I think there was a number of factors, but I think that's a good lesson. And the lesson is that, let your intentions be known, because I didn't speak up at the time either. And so if I would have said, hey, I'm over here, I really would like to take over this business, that might have been a different outcome. But at 21, I was not there. I was just, hey, I just got out of college and, I want to go see the big world. So I think it's a lesson for people in family businesses too, that you've got to let your intentions be known. Let people know that you're interested. If you're not, let them know that too. And then what are the other people that you need to talk to that are involved in the family business, that are family business members that you want to get that message to? And then build the skill set to support that.
And I wanted to follow up to the definition of entrepreneurship here that we started with, which is about being creative and innovative, and also having just do it skill. Do you feel that being able to act or decide to speak up in these situations, or to try to figure out the alliance that would help you accomplish your goal, is it part of being an entrepreneur, or is it something else?
It's a strategy, and you definitely is part of being an entrepreneur. What you always have to remember is that you are trying to create value. So what is the best thing that creates value for that business, whether you're starting your own business, whether you're working in a family business, it has to create value. If you put somebody in that isn't a good fit, that doesn't have an interest in the business, that just sees it as a title, that's going to come back. And so personally and professionally, it's all about innovation, entrepreneurship that creates value, and that's the third step that's very important.
So we haven't talked much about this, but this is a Slice of Mentorship podcast, and I wanted to ask you about your perspective on mentorship, both from a perspective of where does it fit from an entrepreneurial perspective, and where does it fit in your role as a community leader in terms of offering mentorship at scales to students who are involved in programs where you are leading or teaching them?
Oh, it's extremely important, and it's a lifelong process that you can be a mentor and a mentee your entire life, because there's always different roads you're going to take that you really need that guidance from somebody and their perspective. So whether I'm working with young people in a community organization, or I'm mentoring individuals in my water aerobics class about, what exercises they need to do, very simple, but that mentoring process in business is very, very important, whether it's a family business, whether it's a franchise, whether it's an entrepreneurial business. That mentoring is very important, and that needs to take place. So I don't think it's just a student-driven, you're younger, I'm older, I'm the mentor. It's about the experience that person brings to the table. So one thing I've learned, I have some students that mentor other students because they've started a business, or they've been in a family business, and this person hasn't been very involved in the family business but is thinking about it. So those make great mentors. And lots of times they can learn different skills from not only community members, but peers. That's really, really important. But I don't ever think that job ever goes away. You know, one of the number one things that keeps me going is my mentoring. It's a lifelong, makes me feel really good about myself, you know. And that's what it's got to be. It's got to be an exchange. You know, it's not got to be one, you know, that this is the download. And that's where mentoring relationships stop, is it can't be I'll give and I'll take. It's got to be an interactive exchange where you're learning from the person's learning from you. And I always say that I learn as much from my students as I do anybody else. And you got to keep that perspective, that open mind about what you do.
What's your, in terms of doing it at scale, like helping others be involved as mentors and helping more people to find those mentorship relationships? I talk to a lot of entrepreneurship centers at universities. Few have figured out and they're doing great, but a lot have something in place, but there are pieces that they're not super happy about in terms of, oh, my mentors show up, but they show up just for one program and they don't want to come again. Or some mentors are great, some mentors are not that engaged, or they don't have time. So what's your perspective on this from an organizational perspective, or from like a person trying to build a program of mentorship involving other people in those roles?
One of the things that scares business people and mentors getting involved in mentoring programs with entrepreneurship centers or family business centers for that matter is they think the first thing you're going to do is ask them for money. And so they like, oh, got to get away from this. So the first thing you need to do is not ever do that. If they're feeling good about it and what you're doing, they're going to give you money. Forget about asking for that. I could tell you some stories about that. But the second thing is have like that match really work correctly, really work right. And if the mentor says, look, I have very limited time, but I'd like to do it, then figure out a way where it works for that mentor. You know, maybe it might be Zoom, or it might be that the student comes to them at the business that they meet, and that entails details. Lots of times in mentoring programs, they don't really put anybody in charge of it. It's put on the job of the director or the associate director on top of everything else. That's a major, major mistake in my experience. And I've ran 3 entrepreneurship centers and started them. And it needs to be a dedicated person that's putting together the mentorship program that is paid by the university. So they are saying this is important. Our future of our students is important. They will get the revenue back 100 times over when they put a good mentoring program in that has a dedicated person involved in it. That's good at bringing both sides. And you have to be a little bit in the sales area, because you have to go out and you've got to recruit people and say what's in it for them. Just like the students, why do I want to do this? It's not as hard to find the students that want to participate, but it's a lot harder to find those mentors. But to make it worthwhile for both. And maybe the person says, I can't do it this year, but I can do it next year. Okay, so here's what we're looking at for a mentor. Again, have everything laid out on here's how our program works. Get them together in a matchmaking situation, and even if some mentors will take more than one student, most mentors will not. They'll start with one, and maybe if it's a success, they'll say, well, I could work with a couple of the students the next year. But, I always started my programs off with a dinner, matching up both. And I've also done some other things where they're in like a big room, and it's almost like match dating, and they talk to different people, and then we get their first 3 choices on both sides and then match them that way. Because one thing we know about people, if they can make their own decision, make a choice, if they have a choice, they're much more willing to accept it, and they're rewarded by that. That's an automatic reward and an intrinsic reward for them, that they get to make the decision instead of the center making the decision. Here's the person we want you to mentor, you know. And so I think that's a real important part of it. But most of the time, lots of times when centers are started at universities, especially regional universities, they're not given the resources to work with. The center director oftentimes is an academic person in the department, and then they have this job over here that's the Entrepreneurship Center Director, and that's on top of you teaching, research, and service. And then, oh yeah, by the way, we're also having you run the center. So it's an 80-hour-a-week job minimum. And plus you're supposed to get the funding all in place, and the job descriptions and everything else if it's a brand new center, because I've been through starting 2 centers from scratch with no money. So it's like, you know, it's very difficult for the faculty, because they have responsibilities as a faculty member. They also have responsibilities as a center director, and usually those are 2 different reporting relationships at the university. So they're setting them up for failure right away. And oftentimes, the very first thing the university wants you to do is do a mentoring program, because they see that as a way to get donors in the center, donors in the university, which is an outcome, hopefully, that will happen, but that shouldn't be the first thing.
I love your perspective, and I think it resonates with a lot of people that I talk to as part of my work with Traction 5 and as well as this podcast. But I think there is a solution, actually. MIT is promoting it, and I've had experience of running a program that helps address certain pieces of challenges that people are struggling with. It's not to use, of course, it's to have a dedicated person responsible for the mentorship program, and also not to rely on one-on-one relationships, but to have a team of mentors work with one mentee.
Yeah.
And I found that mentors build relationships with each other.
Yes.
And even if this mentee doesn't work out, they love being mentors, and they say,
Yes.
Igor, give me someone else. This one was not good, but I love the experience of working with other people.
Right.
Have you had experience with this approach, like a team mentoring?
Yes, and I think that's a great solution, and it especially works well with schools like MIT that have a big alumni base that want to support the school, or Notre Dame is another example. Lots of times you don't find that at regional schools where people are stepping up to the plate right away. You really have to work at getting those mentors in place to do multiple mentor panels, but it's also with boards, except boards, they don't get to meet the other people as much on a regular basis as they do mentees. But no, you know, that's going to vary. It's got a lot to do with the resources and the people at the university and the history and the culture of the university. For instance, if it's a women's university like UNCG, they don't have that as a history and a culture as much as you were going to find at Chapel Hill, for instance, and NC State. So, you know, we're the women's school. Chapel Hill was the men's school in the history of the school. So we just became co-ed in 1969. So it's a very different history. You got to build that in. So you have to look at the university. And I think when you can build that multiple base mentoring program, that's great. So that's why, to be honest with you, there's a lot more challenges at small, medium schools, whether there's private or public, and regional schools than there is the major schools that are, very noteworthy. So I've been involved with Global Consortium of Entrepreneurship Centers.
Are you going to Texas this year?
I'm deciding if I'm going to, but I've
purchased my tickets
yesterday.
Oh,
good! You're gonna love it. I've been going for probably.
I've been to one.
25 years, 20 years, yeah. And I've won the Lifetime Achievement Award from GCEC.
Congratulations!
So I've worked a lot mentoring center directors and helping them, and there's just a lot of challenges, and But the thing is there's also solutions out there, and the one solution you just talked about works well. But I think each school's unique, and you really have to understand the culture and the capabilities, and oftentimes you have to take it a different direction and set a different path for the university, which is not always easy.
And I think one piece that I'm kind of struggling is this role of university and internal relationships inside the university, and then the community where the university is at. I feel that this team mentorship works when the university is very open to people who live near the school, not necessarily alumni. And I found actually that it was easier for me to find mentors than startups, especially getting started. Just because people, once they buy into the idea, they want to be involved, and then they start bringing their friends, people they know.
Yep. And Igor, you're 100% right. And I think what we can call that is the entrepreneurship ecosystem.
Exactly.
And the university centers, the universities in general, have, if I was to say this, let me keep it to the United States, but it's also worldwide, to be honest with you, because I've worked in over 70 countries right now, is that they're not good at the ecosystem. They're very insular, usually universities. And even when centers talk about being external, using all the pieces of the ecosystem, they're really not sure how to do that. And that ecosystem takes a lot of time and a lot of networking, and it makes it, very hard for somebody that's trying to maintain an academic position and also a center position to do both, and to get out in that community and go to all the things you need to go to be in the ecosystem. For instance, I can tell you just last spring, they had a meeting at a nearby church that had been there for a very long time, that's adjacent to the university, and their membership had gone way down. And they wanted to take this huge building that was a great facility that used to be used for a hall, for meetings and all, and they wanted to make it a art space for artists, an incubator for artists. And we had a brainstorming session. They invited a whole bunch of community members, and I think I was the only one from the university, but there was others invited that didn't go. And some other universities were there. And we spent a good 5 hours just at that meeting. So, and that's not unusual. And then there was follow-up meetings from the brainstorming, and they had hired a consultant to do that, put it all together and stuff like that. And then they're trying to do the next step, which is trying to get grants to get this space renovated and make it a public space for art incubators. But my point is that one meeting took 5 hours. And when you have all the other responsibilities, that's the issue, is you really have to be out there all the time. And how do you balance that with your other responsibilities? That's why the infrastructure at the university needs to understand and be on it, that this is what we're going to give rewards for things like that. Because in academia, that counts as zero. So where's your research and your teaching and your, where's your articles? Yeah, you went to this meeting for 5, we don't care anything about that. And so they don't count it. And so there's got to be a reward system inside the university that makes the ecosystem work. And most of the time that's not there at universities.
That makes sense. And I could talk more about this, but I wanted to come back to kind of the work that you've done. It looks like a lot, and it's too much for this short podcast to cover, but I wanted to ask, how has your perspective on success and personal happiness evolved over the years?
The number one thing is I'm curious. I'm a very curious person, and I love to travel and see new things and learn from people, And so I think my perspective on happiness has been around, and I've been like that since I was a young girl. I grew up in Iowa, as I mentioned, and I really wanted to go abroad, and my family had never gone abroad. And so at 17, my mother set it up that I could babysit one of her best friend's son's children, and I got to go to Switzerland when I was 17 for the summer, and that just really opened my eyes up to the big wide world. And I've just been so curious about everything. And I remember the lady I stayed with, a husband and wife, and she said, "Dianne, you can't be interested in everything. You've got to pick to be successful, like one or two things." And I'd like to say at this point in my life that no, you can have a wide view of interest, and you can publish in a wide view of journals. And you don't have to have this narrow view of everything and just be headed in that direction. I think that the world today makes us have to have a wide view and acceptance and a learning understanding of where we are in the world. And I think that mental health and our students' ability to accept what happens to them is very much based on seeing where we are in the universe and that view, that ecosystem that's around us, and taking, opportunities in that system. And I wouldn't call it taking advantage of that system, but really feeling very grounded in the fact we can have the world around us and really have a big view of it and try different things and have different opportunities. So I think that's what I've learned over the years.
This is awesome. And this is very inspiring because that has been my perspective as well. And this is what I've been doing, honestly. You can see, doing the podcast, being involved in a couple of businesses and talking to people like yourself and taking the chance to travel to new locations to meet people. I don't see that perspective too often. And a lot of people like to stay in the lane.
Yeah.
And especially in the US, it's this is what seems to be the key to success in corporate ladder or whatever. But what you are saying is very inspiring.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Good luck. And I'm happy you're doing the big worldview.
I am.
Yeah. I think that's what makes people successful.